In the other videos, we've spent a good deal of time talking about American comics, which some people might say that comics are an American invention. Of course, the modern comic book did come out in 1933 in New York, but as we've seen through other history discussions, comics go all the way back to the beginning with hieroglyphs and cave paintings. Looking at just American comics would do a disservice to the wide variety out there. There's no way we can cover every comic in the world, even if we had 1,000 semesters. So, we're just going to take a look at a few of the most famous international comics of all time. First up, I wanted to talk about a different style of comic creation called fumetti, or photonovellas. This is where comics are created out of photographs rather than hand drawing. So this came out of Italy following the 1960 surge in the fashion industry. They had all of these images and people were kind of staging them so that you could see the fashion in action. And it turned into something that people enjoyed. And so we got characters such as the Killing, which here is a arguable superhero, definitely an anti-villain, who goes around in a skeleton costume and seeks vengeance, which here we have a story of a guy who is staging wrecks on the trains for insurance purposes. And so the Killing goes down and beats him with an axe. But it's not just Italian horror comics. We've had comics all over the world. They're very popular in Spain and through Latin America. And in fact, a previous student of history of comics from Spain talked about how he read these all the time, and they didn't even distinguish them as photonovellas. They were just comics. One of the most famous American comics was adapting different television programs. So specifically comics like Star Trek, which would take shots that they'd made with the camera anyway and just use different words atop them. Moving back into hand drawing, one of the most famous comics of all time is the Belgian Tintin. So this was a comic that has lasted for many, many, many years, and in fact is dedicated an entire wing of the Comics Museum in Brussels to this adventurer journalist Tintin and his dog Snowy. And they would go out on adventures and meet all kinds of people like Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus and defeat the bad guys. Tintin began in the late 1930s and survived through World War II because of the popularity of the comic. After the invasion by Nazi Germany, the artist continued drawing, and he couldn't do anything overtly against the Reich, otherwise he would be in very much trouble. But he did have people who would wear long dark coats and silver lapels, much like you'd see with the SS, be villains from time to time. The German leaders did not like this, but of course they couldn't do anything to him because it would have caused riots in the streets if anything had happened. So instead we got all kinds of adventures, such as this one here, trekking on mountainous paths where Snowy has a little bit of silliness, sneaking into Captain Haddock's drink, and Tintin, always a bit naive, but definitely a good guy, thinks that Snowy is just suffering from the height. Another famous Belgian comic are the Smurfs. At least that's what we call them in America. Originally, they're the Straups, which that's what they would say instead of smurfing. They're Straufing and Straufing. So this image is one with the famous purple Smurf, where one of the Smurfs is bitten by a bug, which prompts him to only be able to say gnap, gnap, gnap. One of France's most famous comics is Asterix. Asterix and his good friend Obelix are Gaulish warriors, going back all the way to defeating the ancient Romans. So this is a good combination of comedy and quite a bit of action. They use a great deal of dry humor, such as this sequence, talking about Vercingetorix, the last Gallic general to surrender to Caesar, famously throwing his weapons at Caesar's feet, which, taking into this comic, he literally throws them at his feet, which causes poor Caesar to bounce off holding his toes. So a good different perspective than we usually see on the Caesars. And that kind of goofy, irreverent humor is something we see throughout Asterix, as it's grown and grown and grown over the many decades. And Asterix has gone out on adventures, inventing the sport of rugby, meeting Cleopatra, journeying to America at one point and meeting pilgrims. Because time doesn't matter, it's just what's a good story that'll make a good joke. One of the strangest things to happen in comics internationally happened in the 1950s with Dennis the Menace. Within a couple of weeks of each other, we had Dennis the Menace being created for Beantown, which was a comics magazine publication in Britain, who was a kid who wore black shorts and had a striped shirt, kind of mussy hair, and a funny dog, and would go out and pull pranks on people. And simultaneously, in America, we had the creation of Dennis the Menace, who was a kid with kind of sploofy hair, wearing a striped shirt and black pants, and would go out and pull pranks on people. People were so shocked by this, they launched suits and countersuits trying to sue to see who was the actual creator. And as they sorted it out through the legal system, turned out it was a complete accident. For whatever reason, on both sides of the Atlantic, people had ideas for this kid named Dennis the Menace. And it was oddly similar even down to the striped shirt. But it turned out that the Beano character had been created first because the deadline for the publisher was so much earlier, with it being a magazine, but the actual publication of the American newspaper comic came out first. So ultimately, they agreed to disagree, and we had very careful separation. So much so that in the 90s, when the Dennis the Menace live-action movie came out in America, when it was brought over to Britain, they had to carefully market it as Dennis. It could not legally be called Dennis the Menace. Let's take a closer look at some of these Dennis the Menace comics. Here in the United Kingdom, Dennis is a little bit older and a little bit more into the details of his pranks. So here he's wanting to get some soup and trying to steal it from Softy Boy, his nice, nerdy neighbor, who looks almost identical to another character in the American Dennis the Menace. And he comes up with a prank of putting straws together and slurping up all the soup. Meanwhile, Dennis the Menace in America started off pretty dark. He was doing some animal abuse with attacking swans. Here he is tripping his father, saying, "It's easy, you just stick your foot out." Or yelling at his mother, saying, "Don't shout at me, I'm not your husband." But over the years, he would soften and turn a little bit cuter, which here we have him very menacingly waking up his father to say, "Hey, Dad, will you tell me why I'm afraid of thunder and lightning again?" So, quite a bit more on the adorable scale than the really truly mischievous Dennis the Menace of the UK. Also in the United Kingdom, we had another comics magazine, 2000 AD, which focused on adventure and specifically science fiction. So, started in the 1960s and 70s, 2000 AD was a long way off, even though it was 2 decades ago now. But it would give us adventures such as Mach 1 and Dan Dare, and most famously, Judge Dredd. So this is where a lot of British comic writers, such as Alan Moore, got their start. Alan Moore would write comics about a alien with 2 brains, who was the smartest alien in the universe. But all of his schemes had really bad backfiring plans to them, such as a world with the most crime brought him in to solve it, so he created giant robot policemen who arrested everyone, ultimately for everything, so there was no crime anymore, and everyone was in prison. So he decided, well, all we need is giant robot criminals to fight the giant robot policemen. And ultimately ended up accomplishing nothing, and was exiled forcibly from the planet. Meanwhile, Judge Dredd was taking place in this far-flung dystopian future where everybody's living in these huge apartment blocks, and crime has gotten to the point where policemen are judge, jury, and executioner all in one. So these very 80s huge muscles and big guns going around fighting the bad guys who are just impossibly evil and gross. There have been a couple of Judge Dredd movies, one much better than the other, but they both encapsulate this sci-fi aspect very well. Interestingly, if you look into the Judge Dredd comics and they talk about how horrible and violent the times are, when they give their crime statistics, it's actually less than places like Chicago and New York were in the 1970s. And we could talk on and on about comics coming out of Colombia, South Africa, Australia, China, Japan, everywhere. There's truly no end to what can be done with comics, thanks to a large part in the internet. Anybody can hear about anything. And comics are especially easy to transmit because all of the images are the same. Drawings are drawings. You just have to swap the languages out in the word balloons and you've got the same thing. And through this, we can see stories that we might not otherwise see, such as Scott Pilgrim, which of course became the film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, about a comedic Canadian 20-something who has to work on himself and can easily defeat the bad guys and gain coins and powers and things, but really it's about dealing with yourself. So throughout the world, the sky's the limit on what we can do with comics.